Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another production of the Northeast Georgia History Center. I am Marie Bartlett, and I am the director of the Ada Mae Ivester Education Center here at the History Center. And today I have with me Dr. Brimmer, and she will be discussing her book, Claiming Union Widowhood, which covers the topics of race, respectability, and poverty in the post-emancipation South within the framework of Black widows trying to claim widowhood or their union pensions, which she will be talking about more in this interview. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Brimmer.
Absolutely. So my name is Brandi Brimmer. I am a associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I teach in the Department of African American, and Diaspora Studies, trained as a historian. And so it's really exciting to be able to work in this interdisciplinary space that takes African American and Diaspora Studies really seriously, sort of methodologically, in terms of interdisciplinary methodology. So that's what I'm up to. And I would also say that I teach classes dealing with slavery and freedom. We'll talk a lot about that today. I'm interested in questions of biography, and I think you'll see footprints of that in the book. My future work is taking up biography, also inspired by just extraordinary, folks working on different books and topics, some related to North Carolina, but also really taking really creative approaches to the archives. And so that's a little bit about me, what I teach about, and some little nuggets of what's going on in Claiming Union Widowhood.
So let's first begin with the concept of marriage. And how was marriage generally understood and conducted in enslaved populations?
Importantly, even as the way you framed the question, that enslaved people valued and embraced marriage. Slave marriage, using that terminology, means really is sort of a recognition that it's not recognized by law, yet enslaved people formed intimate relationships that took the form of marriages within their communities. This is an interesting sort of idea, because while they had no legal standing within their communities, oftentimes it required the consent of masters. So oftentimes you see enslavers very interested in their enslaved property marrying. Sometimes that could take place on a large plantation with a large population. Sometimes that took the form of cross-farm marriages. That means enslaved populations marrying, maybe miles apart, and people would have some passes to visit their spouses. The marriages themselves, in terms of the celebration or recognition, again, though not recognized by law, a master might officiate. There are examples of enslaved preachers officiating. And so there's a wide array of the way in which these relationships take shape. But what I would emphasize here is that there are also clashes, whereby for enslaved people, for example, as important as their intimate partnerships and marriages are, they really believe in community endorsement. And so sometimes there are clashes with masters who oftentimes see themselves very involved in the defining of a marriage. But that might not always be the case. Sometimes enslaved people were involved in marriages that had no recognition by masters or owners. They valued community endorsement. Even the idea that a child could be illegitimate, not so much in an enslaved community, whereby there's a very broad sort of understanding not only of marriage, but family and community that embraces individuals. The last thing that I would say about slave marriages is their vulnerability. Enslaved couples are, quite frankly, always subject to separation, and that could be driven by the slave market. It could be driven by a death in a owner's family. It could be driven by the marriage of children within an owner's family, and they separate families to give gifts of an enslaved person to their children. So slave marriages take many forms. They are oftentimes monogamous, but sometimes not, because couples are separated. You see enslaved persons, once separated, taking on additional spouses, but perhaps still recognizing a spouse that they're separated from. What I find really interesting in the records is the ability of enslaved persons to keep track of that and those connections and those family ties. And so that alone is fascinating. There's many historians who have used pension records, which I use to document this. But I'm emphasizing this because it does become a really big issue in the later, in my book, but also in the later question of literally claiming survivors' benefits after the war.
So in what ways could Black women stay connected to their husbands during the Civil War?
So one of the things, and this question of marriage and family is important because it actually, keeping it in mind as a value that enslaved people carry helps to understand some of the patterns that you'll see. So for example, even enlistment patterns, I was able to start parsing out men who were not necessarily attached in intimate relationships might enlist, run away and enlist in certain places. I have examples of people who had family members that made sure that their families settled first, and then they would go on to enlist. So in cases like that, where the husband is, ensuring the safety of his family and then enlisting, communication is a huge deal. And there are networks and circuits of communications that move back and forth, not only from refugee sites to the battlefields, but also from the battlefields to former plantations, farms, or owners where people are living. Not all enslaved people are able to run away or refugee or refuge to sites of liberation during this period. But specifically what I find is that in some cases, women remain attached because they literally enlist themselves, if you will, doing domestic services and actually traveling with their husband's regiment during the war. Right. And so there's sort of close ties, and maybe in some instances they have to stay back, but they're traveling closely with their husbands. But the other thing that I found in the records is that oftentimes different enlisted men, as they return to refugee sites or home sites, they are carrying information from the battlefield back to those refugee sites. And so there's these sort of information networks that are traveling back and forth. And I would also say that women are also giving messages, letters, or communicating their experiences in refugee sites that then move to the battlefield. Soldiers, of course, are concerned about how their families are being treated when they're away from the household. They're concerned about enlistment and the vulnerability of their families. And I think that's, sort of across the board, but certainly enslaved or men that are newly liberated are concerned about that. So communication is actually really important. And it's a wonderful question because it's something that you will see, sort of how information is traveling, and quite frankly, is traveling from enlisted men, comrades who are moving back and forth and circulating that information. Sometimes it's coming from women who are traveling with their husbands, but who have to stay back or may return. They're carrying messages back and forth. So whereas the enlistment process, as I started, I would say is communal, so too is the nature of sharing information.
So what happened to people who had been formally enslaved shortly after the American Civil War once they were emancipated? Were they able to go, where were they able to go, if they were able to go anywhere, and how were they able to support themselves? So how did this experience of war and then emancipation affect their lives?
Yeah, this is another fascinating question, and one that probably explains why I have sort of staked my career in this area of study, because I think it's fascinating. You have literally a sea change in terms of legal status, but you have a sea change in the way newly freed people are going to live their lives. And once again, you can begin to see the priorities and the value they place on intimate partnerships, marriage, and family in those initial days, weeks, and months of freedom. So one of the things you begin to see is formerly enslaved people and women really recuperating their lives and thinking about family and marriage. There's an incredible amount of movement, as there was during the war, but on this occasion, it is to oftentimes find family members who were lost in slavery, right? So thinking about the domestic slave trade, thinking about the large numbers of people who were moved from the upper South to the lower South, you begin to see people traveling in search of family members. You asked earlier about how people are communicating and what those communications or networks facilitate during the war. Those same networks are mobilized in the moment of emancipation in terms of locating lost family members. You begin to see people stake their claims on communities and organized families. You see them embracing legal marriage, which was unavailable to them when they were enslaved. They're beginning to organize their religious lives. Many religious institutions, particularly in places like New Bern, had already been in existence, but with emancipation, now they're far more visible. You see families, mothers, fathers, single mothers, prioritizing education and literacy, not only in their lives, but in the lives of their children. You also see individuals thinking about work and how they're going to support themselves. And because slavery, first and foremost, was about work, right, and labor, you think about the skill sets that newly freed people are bringing to bear on the free labor economy. In that regard, you have the military, but military administrator, but also an enormous presence from the United States government in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is established in March of 1865. They are oftentimes in charge of assisting freed people transition to free labor society. But one of the things that's really fascinating is when you begin to look at those contracts, you begin to see freed people really sort of haggling over their labor. And even when you begin to look at choices that free people are making about their labor, for example, you see women prioritizing labor within their homes, right? So initially I talked about recuperating their lives. They're organizing their households, they're allocating and dedicating their labor toward their families, child raising work, the work that's involved in supporting, caring, cooking, doing the laundry, sort of household duties. But they're also thinking about wage earning opportunities that allow them to, again, prioritize family and avoid white interference, the kind of interference that is kind of reminiscent of slavery, making choices around that. And as that begins to happen, I mean, I think that question in and of itself is fascinating, right? Because you're talking about, people often say, you're talking about 4 million people emancipated or with the 13th Amendment, sort of emancipated and transitioning into free labor society. But when you think about this question of gender, and when you think about women's choices in particular, to remove yourself from the labor force, to remove your children from the labor force, now you have a crisis of labor because you have a large portion of the labor force that had been working under slavery. It's not that they're not working, but they're reallocating their work in a way that prioritizes themselves and their communities. And you begin to have a crisis of free labor because free people are not adopting the sort of values that Northerners and military administrators are expecting to come out of the free labor bargain, if you will. And so you also have, in the moment of emancipation, I talked about movement and travel, but also, seeing people's business savvy. They're setting up businesses. They're certainly celebrating the return of soldiers home, coming home. And so it's an incredible moment in which newly freed people are occupying public spaces in ways that hadn't been possible before, and really sort of creating spaces of joy and fulfillment for themselves and their communities as well. And so I would echo what many scholars have said already, right, in the literature, and that is that family is sort of the central pillar of the Black community, and from that, and locating family members and reestablishing those connections really forms the basis of the community extension that you see in emancipation, that those early months and days. Yeah.
So how would information about receiving pensions as a widow be disseminated to these Black communities?
Yeah, so this is a $1,000, $1 million question. It's a good one, and it's a question that fascinated me, and I think in some ways really drove some of the sort of basic ways that I looked at the records for this study. How did they even know? And the answer to that is that what I can tell from the patterns of petitioning, that is how many people begin to petition, when they begin to petition, the issue of marriage is important because women's eligibility and their rights within to establish themselves as union widows hinges on the question of marriage. And so that's why I was making a big deal about that earlier. And without legal recognition, now you're talking about a population that, though their spouses have enlisted, they don't have the legal documentation to even document their marriages, much less know about sort of the different sort of nuances of pension law. And yet they do, and they figure out ways to not only petition, but to sustain a relationship with the federal government over long spans of time on this question. To directly answer the question, the site of Claiming Union Widowhood is in Eastern North Carolina, where the U.S. military Union forces take over relatively early. In March of 1862, you have a large military presence. In addition, you had a pre-existing, highly sophisticated and cosmopolitan community of free Blacks that mixed with enslaved populations who were already thinking about rights, free labor, and had, I'm emphasizing this because they have experience sort of even negotiating with military administrators about enlistment, about working on fortifications, working for quartermasters units. And so that initial phase or pass, one is a question of legislation, one creating space within the pension system's legal system so that formerly enslaved women could make a claim. Once those laws are passed, you begin to see this trickle of cases come up, right? And that's in part because when you think about it, on the one hand, you have women who are eligible for survivors' benefits. On the other hand, you're talking about women who are losing their spouses at war. And some of the most immediate concerns are to figure out literally how they're going to provide for themselves, care for their families, particularly if they're in vulnerable situations. Thinking about pension law probably isn't the first thing, or gathering documents isn't the first thing on their mind. But in a place like New Bern, these individuals have a number of different resources. One, because of the military presence, but also because of the sort of cosmopolitan nature of this community and the large refugee population that develops or swells in that area during the war. You have, and the presence of the Freedmen's Bureau gives them a number of different options of military officials, Freedmen's Bureau agents, and even an emerging sort of Black literate class that is able to assist with these benefits. And over time, they become more and more sophisticated with that assistance. And so the first wave of people that I identified in the pension records, sort of helping women or perhaps explaining to them about the Pension Bureau are white military administrators, white Freedmen's Bureau agents that are assisting them, and in some cases, white attorneys, some local attorneys from North Carolina, others from New York who've traveled to North Carolina during this period. But I would also say when these individuals are acting like this, particularly private individuals with legal training, they're doing that because claim agents have an incentive to assist soldiers, Black and white, navigate the pension bureaucracy because they have a set rate or fee they get for every successful claim that they file. It's actually the government that's going to pay them, although there are nominal fees that they will charge their clients. And so what happens in New Bern over time is, quite frankly, really fascinating. You have an initial wave of white claims agents, many who have legal training, some who don't. But by the 1880s, you have the emergence of a sort of Black class of, or Black bar, if you will, who have legal training, who begin to represent these claims. Sometimes folks don't have legal training. Sometimes they're ministers, they're people who have come of age in these community institutions that we just talked about, that are working really at the behest of the women and disabled soldiers who are returning from war to assist them facilitate those claims. And so over time, you begin to see much more vividly that information about the Pension Bureau as women begin to engage more with the Pension Bureau, as they continue to do that over long spans of time. That information about the Bureau, whereas once was sort of in the holds of white military administrators and other professionals, white professionals, now that information is very much circulating in the community. Everyday individuals are informing each other about what's happening in their case, how they might comport, claims that they might be eligible for, and it becomes, through neighborhood networks, people begin to share information about the process. The other piece of this that I've been able to derive from the records is when people are witnessing for one another or coming forward to give affidavits or legal statements about a person's service within the war, or to witness or discuss the legitimacy of the marriage of the woman coming forward. Oftentimes you'll see those same people showing up in other people's cases. That is to say that soldiers' widows are showing up for some, but they're also showing up for other widows. It becomes very much a communal process, in New Bern at least, where you can begin to trace not only neighborhood networks, not only wartime movement, but oftentimes you can trace, which was the case for me, is that you can really trace this process of communities, sort of reasserting themselves and reestablishing themselves. One community in particular in Eastern North Carolina, I was able to trace from Hyde County to the Roanoke Colony, which is a refugee site set up for the families of Black soldiers during the war. And then another group of those people then moved to New Bern together, and you see them literally in one another's cases, witnessing and supporting one another through the pension process. So for me, I wanted to do something different in this project, and that is to say, I didn't want to just tell the eligibility requirements from the perspective of the Bureau, but I wanted to kind of get into the community institutions, how the community exchanged information about pension laws, and how they began to educate one another about that process. So I love that question because I think it's a good one. And I think that it gets to the heart of some of the larger issues that we've already covered in terms of community basis, that in other words, that much of what you see in the pension process is facilitated because of those moments after emancipation, when you have the rise of Black community institutions that then serves as a platform for them to sustain their relationship with the government after the Civil War and well into the 20th century.
So can you lay out the steps to receiving a pension that a Black widow would have to go through? I know that's, you were saying that's not, just what your book is about, because you go into such more about the community and humanize it. It's not just a, bureaucracy process. But could you perhaps lay that out so that we could understand what that process that they would have to go through would be like?
Yeah. So this is a great, so one thing about me, I like basic questions because I think sometimes basic questions open up so much. And I asked the same question, right? I mean, I had to get a hold of, well, how, what was this like? And asking that question also helped me shape and trace a theme and patterns in the work. So again, getting back to this question of marriage, union widows' eligibility hinged on their ability to collect benefits, hinged on their ability to document and prove marriage to the pension bureaucracy to its satisfaction. White widows oftentimes have the legal documentation. Poor white widows in the South sometimes suffer as well, many times suffer as well without having legal documentation, but especially during the wartime years. But overwhelmingly, because of the case with enslaved people, because their marriages are not legalized or recognized by law, they don't have that legal documentation. Now that changes during the war. As they're entering sites of refugee camps, there are military administrators who are insisting that couples marry. So you do begin to see patterns of individuals who marry during the war, they marry their spouse before they go off and enlist. That's a good thing for those folks because they now have documentation of their marriage. But what I also find is that there are women presenting, and again, the Bureau says we're going to create a pathway for formerly enslaved people to make claims by retroactively recognizing slave marriage. And essentially what they mean by that is that in lieu of legal documentation, they will accept witness testimony to, individuals from the community who say yes. And sometimes those individuals are former enslavers, they're former farmers, field hands, overseers who testify saying, yes, in fact, this couple was in fact married. But to return to the question of what the steps look like. So oftentimes women would, fill out affidavits, formalize certified statements, put them together. A claimant agent will help them present those documents to the Pension Bureau. They'll send that up. These are long-term struggles. So it may be a year, it may be a couple of months. In the early days of Reconstruction, might be 1 to 3 years that they'll hear back. And in the meantime, they're continuing to send up evidence, right? So they're sending up that evidence. And oftentimes what happens in the case of formerly enslaved women, because they don't have documentation, a special examination will be called for. What that means is that a representative from the Pension Bureau, before the 1880s, there were bureau examiners, you'll see that language, but after the 1880s, they're called special examiners. They come into communities and literally, so they exist before the 1880s, there's just a shift in nomenclature, but they come into communities and they interview women, they interview their neighbors about not only whether or not they were married, but whether or not the widow remarried, because if she remarried, then she's no longer eligible for to collect survivor's benefits. She would only be eligible for the period of her widowhood from the Bureau's perspective. And so there's a lot of talking back and forth. And so again, to say what I want to just return to is the reason why I love this question, because for Black women, because they don't have legal documentation, and this is oftentimes the case for free Black women as well, there's also oftentimes an extra step in which they have to be interviewed by special examiners. Those special examinations are sort of quasi-legal proceedings, if you will, where they're speaking face-to-face with individuals who represent the Bureau, but for them, they represent the face of the Bureau. So literally, as I talk about in the book, they're talking back to the state. So we talked earlier about how women learned about Pension Bureau, its laws, procedures. This is another place, I would argue, that women become really, really savvy in terms of the number of times that they're having to interact with special examiners. And by the way, those examinations could be very hostile. They can be very invasive. Examiners are asking very, very sort of personal questions about women's private lives, their intimate lives, what they did after a soldier died, whether or not, if the soldier returned to war, were they a good wife, were they caretaking? And they will proceed to ask a large number of people within the community if that in fact is the case. So in addition to establishing their eligibility for widows' benefits or survivors' benefits, what these testimonies offer is a real sort of understanding or behind the scenes look at what working class populations, in particular, Black populations, think about marriage, about how they're thinking about family, how they're thinking about when women, why the roles of wives within a household, the roles of husbands within a household. What are a husband's responsibilities to a wife? What is a wife's responsibility to a husband? So you get this really sort of interesting dialogue, not only from the petitioner, but oftentimes from the community about, sort of individual assessments about people. And then also the sort of places of disagreement and discontent. There are a lot of times you'll look at testimonies from people within the community who say, well, I don't think so-and-so deserves a pension. She wasn't taking care of the husband very well, the spouse. So there's a lot of things that come out of these records. And the other point that I would say, because these are such long-term battles, right? They take a long span of time. I think the other question to ask is, well, what are they doing in the meantime? And so you'll see a lot of transience, a lot of poverty, which is what's happening with on the one hand, women are not only having to present themselves as respectable in the terms that Bureau officials expect, but also they're presenting their own ideas about respectability that are cultivated within their community. And, a respectable widow, a working woman would go out, earn wages, but also do the sort of caretaking responsibilities for their husband. But they also experience a good deal of poverty in the period in which they had to wait between hearing from initially filing and also hearing from the Pension Bureau. And even when they are pensioned, that's not a permanent status. Those benefits can be revoked or taken away. And I would also add that, because I'm sure listeners want to know, well, how much was a pension? Women were paid on a quarterly basis. It was about $8 a month. So we're not talking about something that's going to, transform their life. But on the other hand, it does, because what it means for poor and working class women is that they have a social safety net that we begin to talk about in the early 20th century with Social Security benefits, but they have a reliable source of income now that enables them to, maybe if a position that they are holding isn't the best sort of working conditions, they can kind of remove themselves from the labor market. That gives them more stability to be able to do that. The last thing that I would say about these benefits, just as a point of clarification, is that these women would be collecting the same amount as white widows in the North. And so it's an extraordinary sort of intervention or infusion of cash into the daily lives of women, as well as disabled veterans, right? Because all of them don't die during the war, but they're coming home, they receive they receive benefits for disabilities. You know, it's not a transformative amount of money, but it certainly is an amount of money that allows them to remain comfortable, to have some stability in their lives. And I think this question is really important, particularly when you think about what we were talking about earlier in terms of the transition to free labor. So as you have a population of newly freed people moving into free labor society, you also have them petitioning and engaging legal institutions, governmental institutions. And in the case of survivors or Black Union widows, they're bringing resources within their communities to support the very institutions that we were talking about earlier.
Would you like to tell us any more about your book, perhaps where viewers would be able to purchase it if they were, interested in today's presentation and wanted to learn more?
Thank you so much. Well, so the book is published by Duke University Press. So you can go to Duke University Press directly and purchase it. You can also find it easily through major booksellers across the internet. So, but I really urge people just to purchase it directly from Duke University Press. The other thing that I would say about the book, usually sort of I read case studies, but one person that I just wanted to talk about, who we were talking about claims agents and the rise of Black claims agents in a particular moment. One of those figures to emerge is a former enslaved man who lived in Eastern North Carolina, from what I can tell, refugees to New Bern sometime during the Civil War, is self-educated or self-taught, to borrow from Heather Williams, and begins to represent claims. He's not a certified attorney in the state of North Carolina, but he does have the knowledge, acquires enough knowledge and the writing skills to represent the overwhelming number of cases that I looked at in Eastern North Carolina. And he renames himself Frederick Douglass. And so oftentimes when I'm talking about the book, people say, oh my gosh, that's the Frederick Douglass, but I always have to remind people, not the abolitionist leader, but a person who renamed himself Frederick Douglass. But I mention that because I'm working on a project now that really sort of traces Black legal communities, and Frederick Douglass, the claim agent who shows up in my book, is going to be a central figure that guides us through Black life in the late 19th century. And so viewers can expect, or your audience can expect, to learn more about naming traditions. They can expect to learn more about Black legal communities and more around those themes, and probably see much more about the Pension Bureau and the other legal actors who move through this process. So thank you.
Absolutely. That sounds fascinating as well as you continue your work in this subject. And thank you again so much for being with us today.